Good Tuesday. Today's reading, we have the kind of pivotal story in the life of Abraham. So we've been reading Abraham's stories for a few weeks now, and this is sort of the culmination. This is the high point, the climax, the binding of Isaac, as it is commonly known, where Abraham believes that he will lose his son. But in Genesis 21, we have a much less well-known story, the exile of Hagar, where Hagar believes that she will lose her son. So there's this very interesting symmetry going on in these two stories. And if you have a few moments today, I reckon that you should take some time to try to notice the similarities in the stories and see what is going on there, because it's definitely not an accident. So let's just point out a couple things about the Hagar story first. Some fascinating things. I remember that Hagar, we met her back in chapter 16. Her name literally means immigrant or foreigner. So back in chapter 16, Sarah got upset at Hagar because she was carrying the heir of her husband. But Hagar hadn't done anything wrong. It was actually Sarah's idea to have Abram sleep with Hagar to produce an heir. But that story tells us that Sarah oppressed Hagar because of this. Because Hagar was carrying the heir, Sarah oppressed her. Interesting, isn't it? Literally, it says that Sarah oppressed the immigrant. And in that story, God comes to Hagar, the immigrant, and listens to her and cares for her. And now here in chapter 21, we have the same thing occurring again. Sarah has now miraculously given birth to the seed of promise, Isaac, the heir. And as a result of having given birth to Isaac, she doesn't want Hagar or Ishmael around anymore. So she sends her off into the desert with essentially what is a bottle of water. And the expectation is that Hagar and her son, Ishmael, will die out there in the desert. But then in this story, chapter 21, again, God comes to Hagar, to the immigrant, and he cares for her in the wilderness, and he saves her son. In fact, God makes a promise to her that he will bless Ishmael. So again, here, God cares for the immigrant, the foreigner. What's fascinating about this is that when you get to the Exodus, and God gives the law to Israel, in Exodus chapter 23, God says to Israel that they should not oppress the foreigner. What's interesting about this, it's literally the sentence is, do not oppress Hagar. Don't be like Sarah and Abraham. I love noticing how these stories are speaking to each other. See, Abraham and Sarah were responsible for oppressing the foreigner. But God cared for her. And so now God instructs his people, the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, that they should also care for the foreigner, for the immigrant. And in so doing, they are being like God, which is also what the law says that it should be. Be holy as your Father is holy. So I wonder, us as God's people, how are we going caring for the foreigner and the immigrant? I think I pointed this out about chapter 16. It's very interesting to notice that Hagar is an Egyptian. And so Sarah, who is an Israelite, oppresses Hagar, the Egyptian. And then in the Exodus story, the Egyptians are oppressing the Israelites. It's saying something about humanity. We tend to oppress the people around us. How are we caring for foreigners? How are we caring for immigrants? Who are we oppressing? Now, there's so many different ways to apply this. But I think as Australians, we should, well, as a nation, we should be thinking about our reputation for the care that we have for foreigners and immigrants. It is definitely not something that we should ignore, and it's not something that we should shrug our shoulders about. Maybe take a few moments to reflect on that and how that could impact your life and the decisions that you make. Okay, now moving on to the binding of Isaac. Let's deal with this quickly because I'm sure you've heard many a good sermon about this story. like I said, the story is the defining moment of Abraham's life. So far, we've seen Abraham. He has incredible moments of faith, and then he has actions that are totally abysmal. And this story begins by telling us, sometime later, God tested Abraham. So this is a test. And that's important to notice that. It should frame the way that we read the story. Before we get too carried away with the idea that God asked him to sacrifice his own child, to sacrifice a child to the gods was common and barbaric in all the other religions of the ancient Near East. Remember, it is a test that changes the way we read the story. Now, we as the reader know that it is a test, but Abraham, as a participant, he doesn't know that. He just knows that God has invited him to take his son, his only son, whom he loves, the one who was promised to him, the one who he has waited for years and years, and to sacrifice him. And do you notice that Abraham silently obeys? Abraham, eventually, when he does speak, he says to his servants, I and the boy will go over there to the mountain. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Now, what's going on here? Either Abraham is boldly just lying to these servants, or perhaps Abraham trusts God's promise that Isaac is in fact the child through whom his offspring will come. Maybe he actually believes that they will go over there and that they will come back, regardless of what it might seem like in the meantime. Isaac asks his father, we have wood and we have fire, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham replies, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Now again, either he is boldly lying to his son, his only son whom he loves, or perhaps Abraham trusts the promise of God that Isaac is the chosen child through whom God's promises will come about. He gets to the mountain, he arranges the wood, he binds Isaac, he lays him on the altar, and he raises the knife above his head. The tension of this story is so fantastic. And then, with the knife in the sky, God intervenes. He provides a lamb for a sacrifice, and to this day it is said, on the mountain of God it will be provided. Now, did you notice that at the end of the story, God honors Abraham's faith by making an oath with him? This is actually new. God hasn't made an oath yet. God swears to Abraham. He swears by himself, which is something that rarely happens in the scriptures. Now, let me get my preacher hat on for a moment. Special points for noticing the connections to the story of Jesus, and especially the fact that God provides on the mountain. On the Mount of Golgotha, it will be provided. And then one day, ultimately, on the Mount of Zion, it will be provided. God provides on the mountain. For the immigrant, for the Israelite, God is a wonderful provider. Have a good day.